Happy Friday, monsters. I don't know about you, but this gray, gloomy weather just makes me want to cozy up with some spooky pals, braid each other's hair like Wednesday Addams, and take turns telling hair-raising tales of murder. That's why we started our little true crime cult. But not to worry, you've landed in the cult with all of the baby goats and none of the brainwashing. If you're just finding us now, allow us to introduce ourselves. I'm Angelina, and I'm here with my bewitching BFF, Aurora. How are you and all of your spooky pooches doing?
I'm pretty good, and the dogs are doing great.
Awesome.
Cleo has learned to bark after
That's
Sebastian,
great.
the evil Pomeranian, has taught her. So
that's very, I'm sure, enjoyable for you.
Yeah, just fun times. I do have to say I had such a interesting Hungarian experience last week. I had to take Cleo to have her stitches taken out from her C-section from having the puppies. And guess how much that costs in Hungary?
$3.
$6.
Holy shit. That is so amazing. This would be like $100 in Canada.
I was going to say, and I think the vet is a little bit more affordable in Canada than the US. In the US, I don't think you can leave the vet spending less than $400 unless it's something very small and maybe it's $200. But I was like, there is absolutely no way that could have happened anywhere in the US. $6.
That's interesting. I wonder how that affects sort of the pet having culture, because I feel like in America there's a lot more of those dogs and cats that people just have, that live outside and they're I don't know, they're an old dog and they don't get checkups or anything. And I'm I wonder if that's why, because it's well, I'm not spending $500 every month to check up my dog and tend to his little things.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. Maybe.
Who knows?
Well, just because you tune into our show each Friday, we like to think of you as honorary monsters. But if you want to be the real deal, an official member of the MMN commune, you can join us at patreon.com/MurderMurder.news. How it works is you pledge whatever monthly amount you like to show us support for all that we do. Maybe just a couple bucks, maybe more. You decide. And in the show you how much we appreciate your support, we'll give you your own official title like Deacon or Grandmaster of Goats. We'll send you a bit of murder merch, and you'll have exclusive access to our regular patron-only content. We like to get a little more personal with our patrons. We share a weekly newsletter, and at the end of every month, we release a special video episode so you can see us in all of our pajamaed glory.
Yeah, we've really got style after this pandemic period. We've come out of it just looking fantastically sweatpant clad and unhairbrushed. It's wonderful. Yes. You all don't want to miss it. So before we dig in, let's take a look at some of the true crime stories that made headlines this week. Bronx apartment building superintendent Ernesto Garcia received a complaint last Saturday that there were maggots wriggling down through a tenant's ceiling. This led Garcia to call authorities, who discovered the decomposing corpse of domestic violence victim Ashley Ducille in the living room of her apartment. On the floor nearby was a man's body with a gun next to it. The superintendent recalled Ducille made frequent calls asking him to check up on her or to change the locks, as she feared the worst from her abusive boyfriend. Both bodies were found so decomposed that they were beyond recognition, but police informed Ducille's family that she is the female victim and that the man is assumed to be her abusive boyfriend, and that the two died in a suspected murder-suicide.
So sad.
Yeah.
Earlier this week in Stockholm, Sweden, 2 children under 10 years of age were found seriously injured after having fallen 15 meters from an apartment block window. Authorities called to the scene quickly discovered the siblings had been thrown from the building after being stabbed by their father. The children were airlifted to the nearest hospital, but the youngest child died overnight, and the other continues to fight for their life. Both parents have been arrested.
Now, before we get into our story, we just want to say that while our tone is light in the intro, we do take the topics we're discussing very seriously. We are best buds, and we love chatting together every week and turning it into a podcast. We want to share that passion with you and to create a vibe where all of you feel like our best buds too. We joke about us friends forming a cult or commune, but that's not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, which we do occasionally talk about in our weekly stories. We feel it's important to open up and talk about even the darkest aspects of humanity and the downright scary things that come up in the news. But we want to make it clear that our intention is never to sensationalize, and we always try to deliver these stories with respect to all parties involved or affected by the crimes we discuss.
We always post our sources in the episode description, so you can do some digging on your own if a story we present piques your interest. But you should know that if you ever feel we get it wrong, either in our tone or in the details of the case, we want to hear about it. We are more than happy to make a correction or give an update on a case we've discussed in previous episodes. So feel free to reach out to us at MurderMurder.news@gmail.com. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include child abuse, child murder, torture, brainwashing, poisoning, sexual abuse, abduction, confinement, shooting, and stabbing. So pretty much everything.
All the things.
Yes. So if any of those are particularly sensitive for you, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
So we've got a mountain to climb today. Plenty of podcasts have done multi-part episodes about this subject, and we're going to try and get it in one swoop. But hopefully you'll still learn something new from this episode, even if this particular tale is ubiquitous in true crime circles. We've done a heck of a lot of research because we wanted to learn a little something ourselves and prove that even the most sensational stories can be worth another look. Not to mention, though all of our listeners are most certainly true crime fans, some of you are younger and some of you got into true crime later in life. And so even some of the biggest stories from true crime history may be new to you. So let's start right where we are, the part of the story that most of you are probably familiar with. During This Week in True Crime History, on November 18th, 1978, a total of 918 people lost their lives in the Jonestown Massacre in Guyana. The event was the largest mass death of American citizens in history up until 9/11.
Jonestown was a remote settlement established by the People's Temple, which was a new religious movement, or cult, which was started by Jim Jones in the 50s, and prior to moving to Guyana, the group was based in California. You've probably seen photos of Jim Jones, who had a bit more of an Elvis or Roy Orbison look going on, sporting sideburns and sunglasses, along with some typical reverend garb. His followers were not so remarkable. They were mostly ordinary people with no special look or uniform to identify them as members of the People's Temple. The group moved to Guyana to evade media scrutiny in California. We can name plenty of cults that started around this time or earlier, but even in the later days while the group was in Guyana, cults really weren't something people were talking about. Without the internet and with news outlets not yet examining what separates a cult from other religious movements, folks didn't really know what to make of Jim Jones and the People's Temple. But I guess Jones wanted to get a jump on things and move his group somewhere more isolated before anyone took a close enough look at them to see that what was really going on here was manipulative and dangerous. Then what happened? The familiar story is that Jim Jones convinced his faithful followers to, quote, drink the Kool-Aid, which was laced with cyanide, in a special ceremony that ended in a mass suicide of all the Jones followers, followed by Jones shooting himself. Creepy, unprecedented, but pretty cut and dry. That's the full story as most people know it. But let's talk about a few common misconceptions about Jim Jones, the People's Temple, and the Jonestown Massacre.
For this segment of the show, a great deal of our research came from an episode of a podcast called You're Wrong About, which is a fascinating show that we highly recommend. If this episode leads you down a rabbit hole and you're left wanting to learn more and more about Jonestown, the Jonestown Massacre episode of You're Wrong About is a great place to start. So the first misconception to address is something we've mentioned on the show before, and if you're a real true crime fanatic, you probably already know this one, but they didn't drink Kool-Aid in Jonestown. In fact, it was Flavor Aid, which is a cheap knockoff of the popular drink crystals. We know this because film footage taken on the compound before the big event shows Jim Jones opening a large chest, inside of which boxes of Flavor Aid were clearly visible. It's likely that the Kool-Aid brand became synonymous with the Jonestown Massacre simply because Americans often use the most popular brand name in a generic sense to refer to any similar products. I find this also happens quite a lot in Quebec in particular, not so much in the rest of Canada, but here in Quebec, it's Kleenex and Scott towels and Javex and most definitely Kool-Aid, regardless of the actual brand that you buy.
Yeah, another one that's interesting is Kraft Dinner.
Yeah, Kraft Dinner. If you're not Canadian, you might not have heard of Kraft Dinner. In America, it's called the much more reasonable Kraft Macaroni and Cheese, which is what it is. And in Canada, for some reason, we eat Kraft Dinner. I don't know what the heck that is or where
Kraft
that came
dinner.
from.
And honestly, in the US, we would just say mac and cheese.
Yeah.
Like even if you're making like Kraft, which probably has no real cheese in it.
You're not going to be like Kraft Macaroni and Cheese, I guess. But even on the box, it says that, which is more reasonable than Kraft Dinner. Like we don't just call it that. The company issues macaroni to Canadians as Kraft Dinner.
Right.
Anyway, Kool-Aid, unsurprisingly, were not fans of the common mix-up about Jonestown and have spent significant sums of time and money to debunk it.
Members of the People's Temple are often wrongly remembered as a group made up entirely of hippies. Just because it was the 70s, older people had it out for hippies and would blame all the world's problem on them. Michael on You're Wrong About podcast likened this to today's hate of millennials. Out of the known Jonestown defectors out in the world, a few of them were definitely hippies. But we're talking about a group of hundreds and hundreds of people. And again, it was the 70s. So this is not unusual of any large group of people. Another misconception would be that this event can be used as an argument against socialism, and that this proves that socialist ideas are dangerous. In fact, if there was more socialized programs in place in America, there would be no need for white knights to show up promising to offer a dreamy socialist lifestyle. Folks would already have what they need from their government, and they wouldn't be in such a vulnerable position that they would be susceptible to charismatic cult leaders. And what you think you know about Jonestown is that a mass suicide took place, but the Jonestown Massacre was actually a murder-suicide, and it's difficult to say exactly which of the group committed suicide and which were murdered. Jim Jones had a lot of drugs in his system, but it appears that he'd been self-medicating with amphetamines and barbiturates for a long while, and he had built up quite a tolerance. It also turns out that he wore dark sunglasses all the time to hide how stoned his eyes looked, which sounds kind of relatable to my
You're like,
years.
hey, I do that.
Yeah. His followers had no idea he was using. His autopsy showed that Jones' fatal gunshot wound was likely self-inflicted.
When it comes to the followers who willingly drank the Flavor Aid, many of them may have been unaware that it was poisoned. What you might not know is that as part of Jim Jones' whole brainwashing process, he pulled a number of dark pranks on his congregation in Guyana. He would offer a number of followers wine, and then after they consumed it, he'd let them know that it was poisoned. Some would react by writhing on the floor and vomiting, and others would not react at all. Eventually, Jones would reveal that there was no poison. It's not certain whether the folks vomiting on the floor were experiencing a placebo effect or if they were actually actors hired by Jim Jones. He would also stage theatrical run-throughs of what he referred to as revolutionary suicide, borrowing a concept from Huey Newton. Not just killing yourself, but killing yourself as a rebellious and political act. Killing yourself before they can have the satisfaction of killing you. Jones convinced his followers that the governments of America and Guyana were out to get them. These little dress rehearsals were referred to as white nights. Many of the stunts that Jones would pull on his followers were very theatrical, and for a lot of it, I imagine that the followers who participated in rituals at Jonestown were having fun acting it out. Honestly, this is something that I think about often with more extreme sects of Christianity, whose followers often fall on the floor speaking in tongues. I can't wrap my head around why they do it, but there must be some fun theatrical elements to it. There's a dangerous and deeply disturbing pattern that you can trace in the rise of the Reverend Jim Jones, and it's a pattern in which he slowly twists and distorts his followers' perspective with creepy tests of loyalty and theatrical stunts while preaching his new religious ideology. By the time November 1978 rolled around, these people didn't know which way was up, and many likely believed that they would not die after drinking the Flavor Aid.
Additionally, some who refused to drink the Flavor Aid were forced to. On a Sundance series about Jonestown, a survivor spoke of how we know this. Victims found on the compound had abscesses on their bodies showing that the poison had been injected into their skulls, into the sides of their necks, into their backs, wherever a syringe could be stabbed into. If you want to get a vibe for what it looked like and felt like for hundreds of people living in Jonestown who were knowingly or unknowingly drinking poison and beginning to get sick and die en masse, we would highly recommend the film The Sacrament, which is a Vice production released in 2013. The film doesn't say it about Jonestown, but it's about a fictional event that very closely resembles Jonestown. It may be news to you, but there was more to the Jonestown Massacre than just Flavor Aid with cyanide. There were additional side murders in Guyana on November 18th, which we will circle back to later. There was a near constant gaslighting, manipulation, and brainwashing coming from Jim Jones for the duration of the existence of the People's Temple. The religious movement began with Jones reaching out to the most vulnerable people in his community: immigrants, Black Americans, people of color, anyone feeling oppressed by classism or racism. He acted sympathetic to their causes of marginalized communities, but judging by his manipulative behavior, this was probably just a ploy to lure people into blindly following Jones and his movement.
The group's move to Guyana from California was an incredibly manipulative move. When you remove people from regular American society and they don't see any ordinary people out walking around in their town, it's 100% members of the People's Temple. Any weird shit going down inside Jonestown can easily start to feel normal, and the line between what's real and what's not starts to get real blurry. In Jonestown, people were vomited on or urinated on as punishment. Folks were asked to strip naked in the town square as public humiliation. People grew to accept this stuff as fine and normal. People were shut in sensory deprivation boxes underground in the jungle by Jim Jones, blindfolded and told that there were eels and snakes down in there with them. They were forced to participate in public boxing matches that went on until one competitor was knocked unconscious. Additionally, Jones told his people exaggerated stories about what was going on back home in the USA. He said Black folks were being massacred and humiliated and abused en masse. He made people believe that Jonestown was the better option, and he pretended that the world was on the verge of a nuclear war. At this point, he might have even believed some of his own bullshit, so to speak, due to his drug use and due to the fact that he was also living in isolation in the middle of nowhere in the jungle of Guyana. His own mental health was not at its peak at this point.
Jim Jones was also incredibly paranoid about the U.S. government in general, which was a concern that the people could get behind because, again, it was the 70s and there was actually some pretty undesirable stuff going on behind the scenes at the CIA, like MKUltra, which used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental states and brain functions, such as the covert administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs like LSD, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal and sexual abuse, in addition to some other forms of torture. So he lured them with paranoia about the government and then used the same tactics and more against his own people. Jim Jones was a perpetrator of sexual abuse as well, having sex with his followers regardless of gender, and acts that seemed set on psychic domination rather than sexual pleasure. He was like an incubus of sorts, stealing energy from his victims as he had sex with them, all the while making himself into a martyr, playing up that he didn't want to, but just had to sleep with them. It was part of some prophecy. And the victims believed they had owed it to their leader, to their faith in general, to go willingly. Another thing you might not be aware of is that Jones would have his followers falsify documents stating that they had molested and abused their own children or had committed other serious crimes just for future reference so he could blackmail anyone he wanted should the need arise. He also took their passports. So it was next to impossible to get away should anyone want to get away from Jonestown.
There are also a couple of conspiracy theories about the Jonestown Massacre, which you can hear more about on the podcast Conspiracy Theories, which has an episode called Jonestown Massacre that came out in April of 2018. One theory is that Jim Jones committed suicide, that is, faked his own death. The other theory is, what if Jim Jones was actually right about his paranoia about the government coming to destroy him and his followers? Could it be possible that the CIA actually sent in agents to kill Jim Jones and everyone else living in Jonestown? Well, I think that one is pretty much debunked because there are survivors. 36 people who began their day in Jonestown on November 18th managed to survive the massacre. That includes a 73-year-old woman named Hyacinth Thrash, who had hid under her bed as the ritual began, with young children being marched out of their homes. When she hid, she must have fallen asleep at some point, and when she awoke, everyone she could see was dead. Grover Cleveland Davis was hard of hearing and had reportedly slept through the death assembly. Stanley Clayton and Odell Rhodes were two men who, independently of each other, decided not to participate in the deaths. Tim Carter, Michael Carter, and Mike Prokes, who were dispatched by the Jonestown leadership, were carrying money to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown. So they missed the death assembly. Prokes actually committed suicide 4 months later. There were also 16 surviving defectors, which we will talk a little more about later, and 11 Jonestown residents in a party led by Richard Clark and his partner Diane Louis. These people left the community on the morning of November 18th and walked 37 miles to Matthews Ridge, pretending to go on a picnic so that they could get out of the deaths. There was also Herbert Newell and Clifford Geig, who had been dispatched from Jonestown early that morning to take a temple boat called the Cudjoe down the Kaituma River for supplies. So these folks have survived to tell the tale of Jonestown, and you can hear some survivors' accounts on the Sundance series, which is called Jonestown: Terror in the Jungle.
Aside from the survivors, there's also a recording, which is referred to as the death tape, which resides in the public domain, so we can actually play some of it for you. We can't play all of it because it's 44 minutes long, but here are some choice excerpts.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Not only we're in a compound situation, not only are there those who have left and committed the betrayal of the century, some have stolen children from others and they're in pursuit right now to kill them because they stole their children. And we are sitting here waiting on a powder keg. I don't think this is what we want to do with our babies. I don't think that's what we had in mind to do with our babies. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. So my opinion is that we be kind to children and be kind to seniors and take the portion like they used to take in ancient Greece and step over quietly, because we are not committing suicide. It's a revolutionary act. But to me, death is not a fearful thing. It's living that's treacherous.
I was speaking about the plane for us to go to Russia.
To Russia. You think Russia's going to want? No, not going to. We're not. You think Russia's going to want us with all this stigma? We had some value, but now we don't have any value.
Well, I don't see it like that. I mean, I feel like that as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith.
Well, everybody dies. Someplace that hope runs out because everybody dies. I haven't seen anybody yet that didn't die. And I like to choose my own kind of death for a change. I'm tired of being tormented to hell. That's what I'm tired of. I'm tired of it. Life has no meaning. I'm the best friend you'll ever have. I will take your call. We will put it to the Russians, and I can tell you the answer now because I'm a prophet. Call the Russians and tell them, see if they'll take us.
I said I'm afraid to die.
All ready to
to go. If you tell us we have to give our lives now, we're ready. I'm pretty sure all the rest of the sisters and brothers are with me.
Who walked out of here today? Did you notice who walked out? Mostly white people. Mostly white people walked. I'm so grateful for the ones that didn't, those who knew who they are. It's hard only at first. Living, you're looking at death. It only looks. Living is much, much more difficult. Raising up every morning and not knowing what's going to be the night's bringing. It's much more difficult. It's much more difficult.
I just want to say something to everyone that I see that is standing around and crying. This is nothing to cry about. This is something we should all rejoice about. We should be happy about this. They always told us that we should cry when you're coming into this world. Well, when we're living and we're living it peaceful, I think we should be happy about this. I'm glad you're my brothers and sisters, and I'm glad to be here. Okay.
Please, for God's sakes, let's get on with it. We've lived as no other people have lived and loved. We've had as much of this world as you're going to get. Let's just be done with it. Let's be done with the agony of it.
So it's easy to tell what was going down in Jonestown, and I think it's safe to say that it wasn't a mass murder carried out by the CIA. As for whether Jim Jones faked his own death, we're not convinced he would be able to stay out of the spotlight for long, so if he had survived, he probably would have surfaced by now. For those who heard those clips and wondered how anyone could follow such an outright abusive narcissist like Jim Jones, think back to what you know about abusive relationships on a smaller scale in romantic relationships. The abuse gestures start small and make you question whether it was even so bad, or maybe you're just making a big deal of nothing. By the times escalate to outright repulsive behavior, the victim has already overlooked so much that reality gets really a bit blurry. The cult awareness movement was actually formed in response to the Jonestown Massacre. Before this, people really didn't feel the need to know or understand how trauma works or how manipulation works. But now they're seeing ordinary, intelligent people, their loved ones, and their neighbors falling prey to this destructive cult. And in trying to understand the seriousness of all this, people began to learn about the seriousness of domestic abuse situations and the mentality of why people don't just leave as a byproduct.
So how did they get to the Jonestown Massacre? What was this group like leading up to the events in Guyana that November? And how did it escalate to utter pandemonium? Jim Jones grew up the son of a KKK member. Jim was decidedly anti-racist, seemingly as an act of rebellion against his father. As a child, Jim would pontificate to his little pals like a creepy little baby preacher. He was passionate about human rights and racial equality, and his efforts were instrumental in the desegregation of Indiana, where he grew up. He would set up stings in restaurants that refused Black patrons, landlords who wouldn't have Black tenants, and he championed for anyone who was subject to racial oppression at work or in the community. Jones founded the People's Temple of the Disciples of Christ in 1954. At first, it was called the Wings of Deliverance. It actually started in Indiana, where Jones is from. The organization combined aspects of Christianity with communist and socialist ideology. In a biographical recording, Jones said, "How can I demonstrate my Marxism? The thought was, infiltrate the church." So it's certainly clear in retrospect that his motive was never genuine. Privately, he was a self-professed atheist. From this vantage point in 2021, even Jones' early volunteer and charitable work was probably some sly manipulation tactic, or he was building his charismatic persona so he could get countless followers under his thumb. But his dedication to socialism did seem pretty genuine. He stuck pretty hard to a paranoid version of authoritarian socialism, which is a system that embraces a socialist economic system but rejects political liberalism.
The First People's Temple was in a racially diverse neighborhood, and Jones went out of his way to encourage people of color to join. Reverend Jim Jones performed faith healing and spoke of clairvoyant revelations. His preaching attracted Pentecostals and spiritualists alike. He would do research on parishioners, sometimes even using private investigators, and then he would reveal personal information live in church to prove his psychic ability. Jones came across as an egalitarian, asking members to come to church in cheap, casual clothes so that poor members didn't feel out of place. The temple also served as a shelter in the off hours, and Jones eventually expanded to open a soup kitchen in 1960. He began to isolate members from their families and communities, asking them to spend every major holiday at the church with their, quote, temple family. He began to suggest that members give up their wealth and material possessions, and in return, the church would cover all of their needs. At the same time, he began to subtly imply that he himself was a Christ-like figure. He later shared his methodology that if you keep them poor and keep them tired, they'll never leave you. Jones put forth a prophecy that Indianapolis and Chicago would be destroyed in a nuclear attack. As members got closer to their reverend and bit by bit let go of their lives outside of the church, they shared in Jones' paranoid predictions.
In a 1962 Esquire magazine article, Belo Horizonte, Brazil, topped a list of the 9 safest places to be during a nuclear war due to its location and atmospheric conditions. After reading the article, Jim Jones briefly considered moving the People's Temple to Brazil, but frankly, they lacked the financial power to relocate internationally. Jim Jones was trying pretty damn hard to get this little cult off the ground, but it was floundering, which would be great news if Jim Jones had just stopped there. Instead, he moved to California. There, he decided there was no sense in continuing to cloak his political leanings in faith. He started openly preaching tenets of socialism, communism, and a religious belief in himself as a manifestation of, quote, Christ the Revolution. He began to refer to the capitalist system as the Antichrist system, which, to be honest, same. I feel you.
Yeah.
If you too can relate, then maybe you're starting to see how folks just like you can simply and swiftly be indoctrinated into a dangerous cult. Folks were generally inclined to subscribe to Jones's political ideology because it wasn't clear yet that communism wasn't working so well. As they talked about on You're Wrong About, information wasn't coming out of the Soviet Union. Most statistics coming out of the USSR and North Korea were faked to pretend that the communism was working. At the time, the general mindset was that there was a race between communism and capitalism, and everyone had their opinions about which model would accomplish their goals first and which system would prove that it actually works. Jones rejected traditional Christianity, referring to the Bible as, quote, white men's justification to dominate women and enslave people of color. Yeah. Understandably, this hooked some followers. The People's Temple took off in California. It established permanent facilities in San Francisco and Los Angeles, in addition to the existing Redwood Valley location. One of Jones's tactics to grow the cult was to inflate membership claims. Fake it till you make it. And it worked. Parishioners convened day and night at branches of the People's Temple, spending more and more time and giving more and more of their lives to their hero Jim Jones, the ultimate socialist. The group intentionally adopted the North Korean model of working from wake to sleep with only an hour's break. Fleets of 10 to 15 Greyhound buses ventured out along California's freeways each week on recruitment missions and later branched out to travel nationwide 4 times each year. In the process, they traveled to Washington, D.C. and spent hours cleaning up the Capitol grounds, which may have had an impact on how many political figures showed their support for Reverend Jim Jones and vice versa. Willie Brown, Walter Mondale, and Jimmy and Rosalind Carter ranked high among his supporters.
Traveling to major cities across America, Jones impressed audiences by bringing his own crew to help him stage faked healings and revelations. Next, Jones set up a direct mailing branch, which collected up to $400 per day, selling temple rings, trinkets, and healing oil. Jones even started his own record label, which turned out albums featuring his own multicultural youth choir. So this was rapidly becoming a very profitable socialist corporation. What the heck? Because of the temple's inflated claims, it's difficult to speculate exactly how many followers the organization had at its peak. They claimed as many as 20,000, but it was probably more like 5,000. Jim Jones' paranoia grew as he convinced followers that he would be assassinated or the entire group could be murdered in a nuclear attack. He really solidified his following by creating a common enemy for himself and his followers in the U.S. government and the media. Also, a little bit relatable.
Yes.
The media was a bit incredulous over the cult of the People's Temple, and it was only a matter of time until journalists came sniffing around. In 1972, an expose attacking Jones in the church was slated to be released after defectors volunteered to share stories of abuse and humiliation. But because the magazine had so many letters of support for Jones, some from prominent figures, they decided to call and speak to him about it before the article went to print, which it never did in the end. But Jim Jones certainly felt threatened, and there was a crunch to find a backup plan in his living situation at the time. Jim Jones was arrested for soliciting sex from a male police officer in a public bathroom in 1977. And later that year, another scathing article about the temple crept into his consciousness. It was time to go.
Jones daydreamed aloud to his faithful followers about creating a socialist utopia in the jungle, letting them know that the temple had purchased land in Guyana in 1974. This planted a seed that grew into a whole spooky forest that members of the People's Temple couldn't see for the trees. There was no way it was going to work out. They didn't have enough supplies, the land was infertile, it was isolated, leaving was nearly impossible. Nevertheless, Jones and nearly 1,000 members of his church packed up and moved to Guyana in the summer of 1977. Guyana was a former British colony with a socialist government and majority Black leadership. Before the group landed in their new socialist paradise, Jim Jones obtained a jeweler's license, which is what allowed him to buy large quantities of cyanide, because cyanide is also used professionally to clean gold. I should mention that Jim Jones wasn't a solitary figure here. Of course, he hired different levels of authority and security within the organization. Jonestown's security team was supposed to serve as the police force of the settlement. They were the only armed citizens of Jonestown, and they were stacked with guns.
Jim also had a wife whose name was Marceline May Baldwin Jones. As her son Stephen Jones described her and his contributions to a website called the Jonestown Report, Mom was not an activist, let alone a revolutionary. She was a wife and mother and daughter, and that energy, that purpose extended beyond her immediate family. On top of the couple's biological son, Stephen, they also adopted what the folks at You're Wrong About called an Angelina Jolie-esque multicultural brood, including their first daughter, Agnes, who was adopted in 1954, the very same year that the cult was founded. Their daughters, Stephanie and Suzanne, were adopted earlier in the same year that Stephen was born in 1959. Jim Jones Jr. and Timothy Glenn Tupper were both adopted by the Jones in 1961. Jim claimed that he was the father of a boy named John, whose mother was a one-time People's Temple follower named Grace Stowen. Jim, quote, adopted John by force. Then Jim fathered another biological child with another cult member named Carolyn Layton. Jim John Chemo was born in 1975. Stephen and Jim Jr. are the only two sons of Jones' children who survived the massacre in 1978, and they were left with survivor's guilt, lasting trauma, and a whole lot of stigma both in popular culture and out in the world as they tried to navigate life after Jonestown. You can hear accounts from the Jones children on the Sundance series as well. One of their sons set the record straight that his mother wasn't standing by doling out poison to the residents of Jonestown on November 18th, but the members of Jim Jones' security team had to hold her down the entire time, and she protested with each child that received the poison.
So let's roll it back to little John Stone, who was 5 years old in 1978. Jim Jones had adopted the boy by force from his real parents, Grace and Tim Stone. Grace and Tim were People's Temple defectors who pleaded in Guyanese courts to release their son from Jonestown. Legally, it didn't seem like they would get anywhere. It was difficult for the government to intervene in Jonestown, with its secrets hidden behind its own heavily armed private army, and with Jim Jones reviewing all incoming and outgoing mail, censoring anything negative. The story of Jonestown that was allowed to hit the media, the government, and family and friends on the outside was very controlled. Jonestown, as Jim wanted it, was a sanctuary from media scrutiny. But family members and defectors, like Grace and Tim Stone, kept fighting to expose Jim Jones and break their loved ones out of Jonestown before it was too late. Rumors of widespread abuse and human rights violations in Jonestown began to circulate. California Congressman Leo Ryan was both professionally and personally interested in what was going on in Jonestown. Ryan's friend, Bob Houston's mutilated body was discovered near train tracks on October 5, 1978, just days after a taped telephone conversation with Houston's ex-wife in which they discussed leaving the temple. Ryan's interest ignited after he caught word of the Stones' custody battle against Jim Jones. On November 1, 1978, Congressman Ryan announced that he would lead a government inquest to Jonestown. The investigative group was set to consist of a few members of Ryan's delegation and some members of the press, but concerned relatives insisted on joining the crew once news of the trip hit the media. After arriving in Guyana to a number of canceled hotel rooms on November 14th, the crew spent their first night sleeping in the lobby. It took a few days of negotiation for Ryan to get the clearance to enter Jonestown. Obviously, Jim Jones was not pleased about this.
Ryan chartered 2 small planes to bring his entourage into the compound on November 17th. The idea was that they were going to go see what was going on, make sure Jonestown residents were happy, and were there of their own free will. And if anyone on the compound wanted out, the crew would bring them back to America with them. Jim Jones sounded the air raid alarm, and residents of Jonestown were abuzz with both fear and excitement as the planes landed, as they thought back to all the practice runs they had carried out in anticipation of a government airstrike on the compounds. Over the next day, things grew more and more bizarre. At first, Ryan thought maybe everything was okay here. Maybe Jones had created that paradise he had set out to. Residents seemed happy. No one volunteered to leave Jonestown with the crew. Ryan didn't realize at the time that Jonestown's inhabitants were being controlled by their leader and that they felt incapable of speaking out. They may have left Jonestown after giving their seal of approval, and Jim Jones might have continued to get away with this manipulative and abusive behavior. But Jim was so paranoid that he kept resisting the visit and any inquiry into his lifestyle. He was argumentative, several times insisting the crew vacate Jonestown immediately, and eventually things escalated to the point that Jones was issuing death threats to Leo Ryan. In time, some members of the cult managed to pass notes asking the crew to help them escape. Grace and Tim Stone, along with some other relatives, pleaded desperately with their loved ones to leave Jonestown. Unfortunately, the Stones were unsuccessful and ultimately lost their son John in the massacre. In the morning of November 18th, Leo Ryan's crew readied themselves to head back to America, while that group of pretend picnickers set out on foot.
Jim Jones knew it was all over. As Ryan rounded up the defectors, Larry Layton was a last-minute addition to the short list of people who had asked to leave the compound. Other defectors were immediately suspicious, as Layton was Jones's right-hand man and would surely never abandon him. When the group got to the airstrip, they began to load into the planes that awaited them. Suddenly, Larry Layton, who had boarded with a concealed weapon, opened fire on the other passengers. Momentarily, some Jonestown residents who had gone to the airstrip to see them off also opened fire on anyone who was still on the ground yet to board. Congressman Ryan, 3 journalists, and a defecting member of the People's Temple were killed in the attacks. 9 others were wounded. According to Wikipedia, the gunman riddled Ryan's body with over 20 bullets before shooting him in the face. The other passengers on Layton's plane subdued him, and then the survivors from both planes fled into a nearby field. With the survivors later reboarding one of the planes, the pilot radioed in news of the attack after taking off. While all of this was going on, Jim Jones gave the signal to start the revolutionary suicide, and all hell broke loose in Jonestown. One mother took 3 young children into the bathroom and slit their throats, followed by her own.
Whoa.
Poison was administered to children first, so that the parents were less likely to back out of voluntarily drinking the poison-laced concoction. Jones knew most parents couldn't live with that guilt, which is something that Jonestown survivors have certainly struggled with. Next in line were the mothers and then the fathers of the children, with Jones and his closest associates being the last to die. All of the money left in Jonestown, more than $7 million in People's Temple funds, was delivered to the Soviet government, quote, for the benefit of oppressed people around the world. The next morning, when the Guyanese army was finally able to cut through the jungle and reach Jonestown, they discovered over 900 inhabitants dead on the property, bringing the death toll to a grand total of 918, 300 of which were children.
Wow.
Yeah.
912 of the bodies, including that of Jones himself, were collected by the United States military in Guyana, then transported by military cargo plane to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, with the last shipment of bodies arriving on the 27th of November. The base's mortuary was tasked with fingerprinting, identifying, and processing the bodies. Resources were overwhelmed, and many were tasked with moving or identifying bodies went on to suffer from PTSD. In most cases, cremation of the remains was handled by Dover area funeral homes. More than a third of the victims were never identified. Larry Layton was the only person prosecuted for any of the events in and around Jonestown. Following his arrest and his 18-month detention in a Georgetown jail, Larry was tried in Guyana on charges of attempted murder. He was acquitted, employing the defense that he was brainwashed. Larry was released from Guyana into custody of the U.S. Marshals, who escorted him to San Francisco. Layton could not be tried in the U.S. for the attempted murders of 4 people, including the airplane pilot, as it took place on Guyana soil. He was instead tried under a federal statute against assassinating members of Congress and internationally protected people. He was convicted of conspiracy and of aiding and abetting the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan and the attempted murder of Richard Dwyer, who was the deputy chief of mission at the American Embassy in Georgetown, Guyana. After over 20 years in prison, Larry Layton was released on parole in 2002, largely due to the testimony of Vernon Gosney, a Jonestown survivor who acknowledged that it wasn't Layton's fault because he was being manipulated and said that if it wasn't Layton, it could have been him. Layton's younger sister, Deborah, went on to pen a memoir titled Seductive Poison, a Jonestown Survivor Story of Life and Death in the People's Temple, which was released in 1998.
It can be difficult to identify a dangerous cult, particularly in its early stages. Usually by the time anyone realizes that a cult is a cult, its leader already has a number of victims under their spell. Culteducation.com has a list of signs that you might be involved with a potentially dangerous group, which includes that the group has no tolerance for questions or criticism, unreasonable fear about the outside world, such as impending catastrophe or evil conspiracies. If former members are looked down on for leaving, or if former members speak out about abuse, or if there are books or news reports that have been released speaking negatively of the group, it might be a cult. The website also includes a list of signs that someone you know might be involved in a cult, including a lot of obsessiveness over the group leader, conversations and mannerisms mimicking those of the group leader. If your friend has a dramatic loss of spontaneity or sense of humor, increasing isolation from family and friends who don't share the same opinion of the group or its leader, or if your friend will justify anything the group leader says or does, no matter how harsh or harmful, probably a cult.
Yeah. As we mentioned, the cult awareness movement and the practice of deprogramming was born in the aftermath of the Jonestown Massacre. Survivors were desperate to dismantle the stigma that continued to hold them down, even after they managed to escape the grips of the People's Temple. They were looked down on as if they weren't intelligent and were the butt of every joke, all the while they suffered through a swamp of anxiety and PTSD. Ted Patrick shot to fame as the, quote, father of deprogramming and formed the now-defunct Cult Awareness Network. Patrick worked to extract loved ones from cult mindsets, putting a primary focus on rescuing followers of the Moonies, who we did an episode on a while back. His controversial practice sometimes utilized extreme tactics like kidnapping and came under fire by religious and civil liberties leaders. Ted Patrick was jailed repeatedly on numerous charges and 3 felony convictions, ultimately putting an end to the practice of violent deprogramming in the United States. Rogue deprogrammers still exist, operating mostly outside the law, but the process has largely been replaced by the kinder, gentler, quote, exit counseling. Exit counseling is a non-coercive approach involving a great deal of therapy that the client willingly submits to, maintaining the control and autonomy that deprogramming would eliminate.
If you fear that you or someone you know might be involved with a cult, we have a few resources for you. Cult-escape.com is a site led by cult survivor John Spinks and features an anonymous test that will help you decide if you're involved in a cult. FamiliesAgainstCultTeachings.org, or FACT, is an organization that offers rescue support for children trapped in abusive groups, assistance for victims of group labor and/or sex trafficking, support for families looking to save a loved one from a destructive group, reconnection support with estranged family members from undue influence, and support services for families and friends of current or former cult members. DareToDoubt.org encourages you to compare your group to the BITE model of control established by leading cult expert Stephen Hassan, founder of the Freedom of Mind Resource Center. BITE stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotional Control. We'll include those and a few other helpful links in the episode description for today's show. And there we have, I guess, the best way we can sum up the Jonestown Massacre.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's a case that I shockingly did not know a lot about because I think I kind of gravitate towards lesser known cases. Like you hear little bits and pieces about the Ted Bundys and like the Jonestown things. And
you're like
I kind of never.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, even though I didn't know anything about it, I was like, well, I didn't know about that. But
I had no idea about the side murder. Like I knew that not everyone was voluntarily drinking poison. And I knew that that was like a bad scene, but I didn't know that there was those shootings. And I didn't know that this was all a result of like a government inquiry that is not stuff that I was familiar with at all.
And I never had any idea the number was that high. Like
so
that it was
many
900,
people.
Some people that died. Like I would have guessed maybe like 30 if you had, like if we were playing a trivia or something and I had to guess. Like I had no idea that many people died. It's so sad.
So you can imagine, like when I was watching the Sundance series, it's like they had some video footage just like panning over the grounds after and showing all of the bodies. And you're just like, it's an unbelievable amount of people. It's like a whole small town. It's like,
so sad.
Yeah, mind-blowing.
So unnecessary.
Mind-blowing. So getting into TV, I want to mention that I finally started watching the show Ghosts, which apparently you mentioned that you had watched the other version of Ghosts in an earlier episode. I guess I'm not sure where the original was based, but this now is the new American version.
Yeah, there's a British version and then the American one, there's like a few episodes out.
Cool.
Right?
So I started with that, which my skating friend, a girl I met at roller dance class, she actually is, I told you that she's really into our podcast. So I finally want to give a shout out to her. So hi, Ariane. Thanks for listening.
Hi, thank you.
She also worked on the show Ghost. So she was excited to hear you talk about it before. And so now she was like, oh, good. I did the American version. So now you can watch that. And so I'm watching it. It's cool.
Yeah. I've seen the first 2 episodes. And like, it's hard, it's hard to find shows if you're not like in the US sometimes. So I actually like got distracted and forgot about it, but I'll go back to it now that you've reminded me because I loved the first 2 episodes.
I just love the concept of like that all the ghosts from different eras are living there at the same time because why wouldn't it be like that? Why would you just have a Victorian ghost and nothing else? Or like, like they're all there at the same time being like, really? It was like that at your time? Like, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so great. I love that concept.
Yeah. And I also watched a bunch of stuff on Sundance because I got Sundance to watch the Jonestown show, and they have a lot of true crime stuff. So I started watching something called Poisonous Liaisons, which is about poisoning murderers. So that is an interesting series. And I watched something called, I'm not sure I'm going to say this right, but it's like Olompali, A Hippie Odyssey. This is like about another weird cult that, maybe seemed pretty harmless on the surface, but they were actually feeding drugs to children. And so a lot of the children from that cult recall growing up on drugs from like age 7. They started like smoking weed and like then they had hallucinogenics and stuff. So very creepy. And while we're talking about TV and movies, I just want to mention that I did see the news that Leonardo DiCaprio is working on making a film about Jim Jones. So perfect timing. We will have to watch it.
Yeah, for sure. And great casting. I have like such a love-hate relationship with Leonardo DiCaprio. Like I definitely get the feeling he's a mega creep. But like he's such a talented actor and I've always loved him in everything he's been in, starting with like Titanic and Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, Romeo and Juliet.
The biggest crush.
Yeah, what was the first thing? I guess it was Titanic, huh? That was his big break.
Yeah, I think maybe Romeo and Juliet came out just before Titanic.
But he wasn't super famous yet. Like
I think like he got famous for that. Like I definitely knew who he was. He was on all the teen magazines and stuff like at that time. So I was excited for him to be in that and I went to see it because he was in it.
Oh, okay.
But then I had read that him and what's her name? Claire
Danes?
name? Claire Danes hated each other on set.
Oh yeah.
Of on Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
So they had actually wanted to cast her because their chemistry was so good in that they wanted to cast her initially in Titanic and she turned it down. And
she was like, fuck this guy.
You did not give me enough money to like work with him again.
Oh no, I bet she really regrets that. Like,
I mean, maybe not. I think her
not.
career's, it's really important to preserve your mental health. And if somebody is just like making you that miserable, she probably made the right choice for herself. And like, she has that show Homeland.
But Kate Winslet was definitely a big star after that. So
yes. Yeah. And I mean, deservedly so because Kate Winslet's so amazingly talented.
Absolutely.
So I have no arguments about that.
She's
and
amazing.
Also, like, I hated Titanic when it came out, but the older I get, the less complaints I have about movies. I just like to be entertained.
You're like, whatever, just put something on. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts.
Background noise, play some Celine Dion, whatever. So now I love Titanic. And my husband worked on that movie.
Yeah, so that's a reason to love it. I don't think I've ever revisited it. Like the last time I watched it was definitely the 90s. So like, I don't know if I should. Same, I was just thinking about Romeo and Juliet because like, it wasn't like that, like necessarily fantastic or groundbreaking of a movie, but it was certainly like a different twist on Shakespeare than we were used to seeing at that point. So I don't know. Maybe I'd take another look.
I just love it.
Yeah.
I love Romeo and Juliet, at least. Like, I just love it. Was that Baz Luhrmann who directed that?
That sounds familiar. I bet, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. He's great.
Yeah.
I
know the soundtrack was fantastic.
And assuming that I'm naming the right director, then I think I love a lot of his movies.
Yeah. I just remember super loving Garbage at that time, and their song was like the main song or something, and the album was great. The soundtrack. So what else are you watching?
I did watch The Conjuring 2, which was great. I had like a horror marathon with my Hungarian wife, Fanny. We stayed in bed all day on Sunday and watched horror movies with Cleo, the dog, in bed and had like a big cuddle party. It was amazing.
That's perfect.
And I also watched, for any of the Bravo fans here, I just watched the episode of Real Housewives Salt Lake City where they arrest Jen Shaw for fraud, for elder fraud and wire fraud, and like seeing the FBI and Homeland Security and everybody like descend on the bus while they're on it was...
Wow.
Gave me a lot of joy.
That's a really interesting and true crimey episode of a non-true crime show in general.
Yeah.
It's getting more and more true crime, though. All these housewives are crooked. What the heck?
They're all criminals. And honestly, like, I kind of hate that we're giving them a platform that they're getting paid for ripping people off.
Yeah, it sucks.
Like, especially in this case with her, where she was ripping off like elderly and like underprivileged people. Like she was like specifically going after underprivileged people because they were easy to take advantage of.
Especially heinous from someone already rich. So yeah.
Exactly. So like that's terrible. And it's like, don't give her money to like tell her story. Like give that money you would have paid her to the victims that she screwed over.
Yeah. Maybe they like, hopefully they can do something like that, because of course it's entertaining to watch. And now we want to like see how these stories unfold. But it's like anytime there's like criminal stuff going on, it's like they could maybe grab money from the show and instead of like any amount of profit that she would make from her role, then that would make more sense.
Her and Erica Girardi, for sure.
Man, what a bunch.
Yeah. We just wanted to thank everyone for all the cute names, for the puppy names that you sent us. You sent us tons of good, like Freddie and Jason, and like lots of good classic like horror names, and a lot of recommendations for the Addams Family and such. So thank you for sending us those. I
Any
am
winning
wait
picks
to
yet?
give them. Not yet. I really do want to see what their personalities are like first.
Mhm.
And they're still now at, just over 2 weeks old, just sleeping and eating. They don't want to be held.
Aw.
And it's like, all I want to do is like pick them up. But if you pick them up and take them away from their mom for like a minute, they scream. It's just puppy screams.
And
I
the
forgot
mom
to
is
get
mad.
a recording of their screams.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a recording of their screams.
Oh, yeah.
For you.
I want to hear
Screams,
this.
y'all. Like, it really sounds very human and creepy.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. So once I get a feeling of their personalities, we'll give you a shout out, whoever's names they go with, that we decide to go with.
Yeah, awesome. That reminds me, the puppy screams of like, I actually had a horror movie night with a friend too, and we watched something on Shudder that just had good ratings or whatever, and it was called Caveat, and it wasn't like, it had pretty great reviews, but it was not that fantastic of a movie, I've got to say. It just had a couple interesting twists. But what was cool about it, and what I'm reminded of because of your puppies, was that they were playing up the fact that I guess a fox's call, or like a loud fox's like whine, sounds like a human woman screaming in terror.
Yeah.
And so in this movie, you were hearing foxes or women screaming in terror, and you had to sort of identify when which was which. So that was interesting. I didn't know that about foxes. Very creepy.
I have heard their screams, and it is terrifying.
Yeah, it sounds like a lady being murdered.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If you disagree and would like an extra helping of murder, you can always find us at MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news all week long.
You can find us on Instagram at MurderMurder.news, where this week you'll find our usual creepy memes interspliced with adorable puppy pics. We posted them, so go check that out. And also a really great video. And on Twitter at Murder News, on TikTok at Murder News, where this week we dug into true crime history to tell you about the case of the Rutherford County Jane Doe. And on Facebook, you can just look up Murder News, where you'll see our page where we have updates to news articles and such.
And when you search for our Facebook page, you will also see our group pop up. You'll want to join that group to chat about murder and spooky stuff with your favorite podcast hosts, as well as to stay in the loop about any upcoming virtual events.
Next up is our book club meeting on Sunday, November 28th, for which we are reading I Know What You Did Last Summer by Lois Duncan. It's a light read. You've still got plenty of time to track down the book and read it before we meet to discuss it on Zoom. It really is a quick read. I read it in 2 days. Like, it goes so fast. I think it's like 100 pages or something. It's really short. Everyone's welcome. We'd love to see some new faces at book club. So if you're toying with the idea, here's your sign to join us.
And don't forget, if you love Murder News, leave us a 5-star rating and or review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast listening platform of choice. Ratings really help us get discovered by new fans who are interested in murdery things. And they also help us know what you like and to continue giving it to you, as well as just continuing to exist and thrive as a podcast. So please do your part. Give us a nice review, a 5-star rating, and we appreciate you. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great weekend. Have a fun week, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Bye.
Bye, friends.